So I want to hear your theory. Have you done a lot of thinking about how the Book of Mormon came to be?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Talk us through how the Book of Mormon came to be. So we're at 1827. Joseph's with Emma now. He's got all this history of treasure digging, but they can't do that anymore. We know that he's known Oliver for a while. Hyrum's got all this theology that he learned from Dartmouth, right? His parents, you said that Joseph's mom had wanted him to write a book for some time, wanted him to be a prophet, right? His dad had wanted him to peer through a seer stone from his birth. So we've got all this cultural sort of stuff in the soup. Yeah. And then we've got Ethan Smith's book, we've got Solomon Spaulding's book that are, I call it Bible fan fiction of trying to explain where the Native Americans come from, try and tie it to the blood of Israel. We've got all that in the soup, right? And then of course we have the Stephen Burrows guy who wrote a book and made a lot of money. So give us your best story of the origins of the Book of Mormon and how it came to be.
Okay. Well, of course, they've been doing this money digging, and now people were becoming onto them. They had swindled quite a few people, and Abner Cole was one of the people that was mad at them. And he'd never come with any treasure. They'd gotten arrested in 1826 in Susquehanna County, couldn't go back there except in the shadows. So they were having to find some new way of, making money in this way that they had always done, for years.
They can't just be farmers.
Well, they didn't want to do that. That's too hard, and they had to cover up. I mean, there's a lot of signs that show that they were dealing in counterfeit money too, while they were, or at least using their methods, and their neighbors said they wrote the book. Okay, well, it's hard to do the chronology because, so there's this anti-Masonic movement happening right before the time when, right around the time he gets arrested. So he has to figure out, and of course Hyrum is in this predicament. Which way am I going to go? And maybe he was with the Morganites all along, planning this new masonry. But then meanwhile, the Second Awakening's bringing in people into all these churches. So they said, maybe it was Lucy's idea. I don't know, but they collaborated as a family because part of the manuscript's even in Hyrum's handwriting. So they start talking about a gold Bible, and they form this what they call Gold Bible Company. And there's even letters in the post office written to the Gold Bible Company in 1827 in the later part.
Okay, can I pause you for a second? Mm-hmm. I think it's really important to understand that up until 1827, there's no record of a first vision ever being discussed. So Mormons like to think of the first vision as the beginning of Mormonism. And so now we've been talking about all this treasure digging, weird stuff, and now we're going to talk about the Golden Bible Company. And Mormons would be like, wait a minute, what about the first vision? And I just think it's important to say...
There's no talk about that. The neighbors, all that lived right by the Smiths, people went and interviewed them. There's the Mormonism Unveiled. And in the neighbors in Susquehanna County, people wanted to investigate people that lived around the Smiths in the early years. They all said, no, they were atheists. They weren't religious. They talked like it sometimes, but they were swindlers and money diggers, and there was no talk of any angel, seeing God and Jesus before. The earliest one we have is 1832.
Right, and that's even his own family members, right? They did. Joseph's parents have no recollection of him mentioning the first vision.
No.
So that's important, because when you look at the first vision, now you think they don't get the dates right, they don't get his age right, And then the details are different, and the details change over time and evolve with its own theology. Well, that all starts to make a lot more sense when you realize that it probably didn't even happen and was never talked about. And so, of course, it's this story that sort of seems to emerge out of thin air and then changes dramatically because it didn't happen in the 1820s.
Right, it didn't. And
It was something made up later and then retrofitted to justify the founding of a religion, as the book that we're about to talk about gains prominence and he gains influence as a result of producing the book. Is that right?
Right. The book came before anything religious at
Yeah.
all.
Okay.
They already had the idea of writing a quote, history of the Native Americans based on Solomon Spaulding's, because they talked about it as a family. It was in their family network. They knew Solomon Spaulding. They knew about that book. In fact, Solomon Spaulding's niece was married to Heber C. Kimball's father, so she would have known him really well, and maybe that's how they got a look at the manuscript or something. But
So as we're doing the timeline, we just have to understand there was no, according to this timeline, according to your understanding, there was no first vision.
no, that was, and Emma's cousin said they were very good at retrofitting stories backwards. So all the stories about 1823, 1824, 1825, going back
The
to
Angel
see
Moroni,
Angel Moroni
the
going, and
visits and the years going back.
that was made up later. I mean, they certainly no record of it then.
Him talking to people, I'm going to go meet Moroni now. I just got a visit from Moroni.
Right.
No record of any of that.
No, but
That was all created later.
yeah, we know from Lucy's history, she made up the story of their family, and it differs in significant ways from what neighbors and other people who knew them said, and she left out things, and we know from the history of the church, which is Joseph Smith's history that he had commissioned by his clerks. He left out all the illegal activities that were going on that we still have records of. So they were good at making up a past history that wasn't correct, that wasn't accurate, that left out stuff, that covered up stuff. And
That's a legacy that's still with Mormonism, right?
Yeah.
Burying the unsavory stuff of our history, rewriting a polished, whitewashed version of history.
Exactly.
That completely changes. That's a legacy that we get from the Smith family very early on.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so you're saying, 1827 Golden Bible Company, what is that? How does that get formed? What is it?
Well, we don't know a whole lot about it, except that that they had letters waiting for them in the post office for the Gold Bible Company. And it was just Smith and and Smith and Company. But they apparently, formed one of these secret groups and were going to sell a gold Bible. And that, they must have thought of it amongst themselves and we're going to make money with it.
But why call it the Golden Bible Company?
Well, because I guess they had the idea of having the golden plates at that time. That's when who knows when they came up exactly with everything, except that you can kind of trace it by records that we do have, because they didn't write down all their secret meetings, but we know they had a lot of secret meetings.
Who? Who do
The
you
Smith
think?
family with Oliver Cowdery and Sidney Rigdon. We don't know exactly when he entered the picture either, but we know he said later that they had a lot of secret meetings. And so,
Because we usually think of Sidney Rigdon coming later after the church is founded, Joseph stumbling upon him in Kirtland, right?
oh, well, yeah, but people said that he was cited in Palmyra. And actually, it's really not that important when he entered the picture, except that we know a lot of that material from his sermons ended up in the Book of Mormon. So it could have been that Oliver Cowdery, who was a peddler who went back and forth from Ohio and New York and was seen many times staying with the Smiths and associating with the Smiths from at least 1823 on, he could have carried some of the sermons back from Pennsylvania, from Ohio, where Sidney Rigdon was, with him when he came back on the peddling visits. Or Parley Pooh Pratt could have done that too. He was a peddler, a tin peddler, who were, by the way, tin peddlers were very associated with counterfeiting. And so there's all these different ways that they could have collaborated, and we know they had secret meetings. So Hyrum has this dilemma. What am I going to do? Because
Alvin's dead.
Right, Alvin's dead. He can't be the prophet.
We can't treasure dig anymore.
Right, can't treasure. And now the Masons are going to turn against me if I don't go, I got to extricate myself somehow. I got to either be an anti-Mason or an adhering Mason. So it looks like that's when they had the impetus to, write the book. They started a Gold Bible Company, and they were going to make money. And Hyrum brags that he's going to be, that they're going to be becoming rich. They're going to make a lot of money with this book.
So to call the Golden Bible Company means that they envisioned golden plates and probably a Moroni as early as 1827, because it sounds like what they're doing is they're going to write a book, but try and create the impression to everyone around them that it's a book from heaven, that it's a book from God.
That it's golden plates, right. And,
so
but they don't start talking about that till 1827. There's nothing about gold Bibles or anything, Well, Lucy actually talked about Alvin as having been designated to be the prophet and have the gold record, and so maybe it was Lucy that kind of had the idea of the golden plates, or because her brother had found a manuscript in Michigan, the Detroit manuscript, so she kind of had, but they had to have collaborated because all these ideas came from different sources, but we can trace where they came from. We can trace. So yeah, they got Martin Harris in on the idea too at some point.
And let me just make sure I understand. So what I'm hearing you say is around 1827, Joseph, Hyrum, possibly Joseph's mom, Lucy, possibly Oliver Cowdery, possibly Sidney Rigdon or others, create this story that involves an angel and golden plates, and they come up with the idea that they're going to write a book and do a better job of what Ethan Smith or Solomon Spaulding or the others had tried to do. But they're going to do it while they create a lore of it being actually some revelation from God, some authentic historical record of ancient Americans. They're not just going to write a book. They're going to they form a secret oath-bound society that is going to create the impression that the book is of not only a ancient sort of origin, but also of a divine origin, which is some would argue it's a marketing plan, right? It's like the book's going to be a lot more interesting if it's tied to gold, if it's claimed to be an ancient historical record, and it's claimed to be created by the gift and power of God. That's almost like a marketing plan. I'm a little more interested in that book than I am just some book that's fiction written by some dude. Is
Yeah.
Is that what you're thinking? I'm trying to put this together.
It started out to just be money. Neighbors said, it started out to be just to make money,
right?
And a spurious history. But
they could have just wrote a manuscript and sent it to the printer. There's all this Golden Bible stuff and Moroni.
Well, that's where the 116 pages, the lost pages, come in, because they started out this book that was mainly just a history or money-making thing. But then all these court trials and the anti-Masonic movement come in, and they realize, we could start a new organization that would syncretize Christianity with Masonry, and we could get a lot of followers, and we could be political players. We could get people and start a radical sect. They didn't call it that, but and take people out into the frontier. So they, Martin Harris gets involved. He's an
Wasn't-
anti-Mason.
Do you think he was
Just-
you get the impression that Martin Harris was fooled, that he was just the money, but wasn't necessarily really in on the scheme.
I think he was in on it. No, he was in on it pretty early.
Do you think he was in on it?
At least as early in 1828, because the anti-Masonic movement got really going, and he was an anti-Mason. He wanted to capitalize on this turmoil going on, and his wife said that she quoted him as saying, "If you just leave me alone, Lucy, I can make some money from this." And she didn't want him to spend money on these money-digging, gold digger, golden plate people, golden Bible companies. She didn't think he should, but he did anyway, and he was in on some of the secret meetings, and he later called it the Anti-Masonic Bible. So it was a way to form this new... Okay, so they start writing the 116 pages, and people said they wrote it in the cave in Manchester. But he said he wrote it in Susquehanna. See, it's hard to sort it out when you have all these conflicting stories as to what they claimed versus what other people said. So you got to say, you got to sort it, tell the two different stories and say which one you think is right because of other details. Well, Martin Harris, they start writing it, but then in February, in 1827, or I got to look at the dates, but anyway, after the first 3 months or however long it took, he loses it.
He brings it to his wife.
Right. She probably destroyed it. She didn't want to. She wanted to stop this whole thing right in its tracks.
But wasn't it all around her trying to prove that it wasn't of divine origin? Wasn't she trying to say, if this really is a translation from the gift and power of God, if I destroy it, you'll be able to reproduce it. But if you can't reproduce it, then it must be a fraud. So in other words, wasn't that all tied into it?
Well, we don't know her thinking that if she was going, trying to. I mean, you're asking me a little bit more detail than
This
I
needs
know.
to happen. I'm just going to tell listeners, we need somebody to write a book or several books on theories of how the Book of Mormon came to be. Because all these things, we have enough information to put together a timeline and sources and to be able to start theorizing where the different parts of the book come from, how they come together, how it was written. Because obviously the brethren are like, the book was written in 90 days and it's a miracle.
Well, people said that they started early in 1827 and they worked on it in the cave. People saw them going there, locking the door on the cave, but then
There was a cave with some really big, strong door, I think your book says.
yeah, and Dan Vogel went and took pictures of it. It was still there when he investigated it.
Okay.
In the 1970s, 80s, whenever he did that article.
Okay.
So we know it's there, and people said, but they're probably counterfeiting money in there, because people did that a lot in caves. But
the point is, Harris takes the manuscript to his wife,
right,
and she destroys it.
And they keep going back between Susquehanna County too. They keep hanging out still on Isaac Hale's property at this point, and with Emma Hale and the Hales. But he loses it, and interestingly, Joseph Smith says, "Did you break your oath?" So we know they had some oath-bound agreement, even then.
Fix your mic so it's pointed right to your mouth. And it's tilted a tiny bit. There you go.
So now they know that they know that if Lucy Smith still stole it, and then they come up with a different translation than that she can, or whoever stole it,
So that relies on this marketing plan, I'm calling it,
right,
which is the perception that it's of divine origin.
Right. They can't now say that this is the translation when they've already said that this is. That the old somebody could come forward and say, "Oh, this was the translation that you."
But this is my point.
Yeah.
That means that that means that Martin Harris's wife was told the marketing plan that it was created from the gift and power of God, which
Well-
means either Martin believed it or
Okay.
Martin told her that, one of the two. But it's clear that she was getting rid of it partly under the assumption that it wasn't just a book that was written, but it was a book that was written by the gift and power of God.
Well, she actually hired a lawyer and filed a lawsuit saying that Joseph Smith was swindling her husband into believing, or that he was tricking her husband into getting.
Which would mean that Martin wasn't in on the scam, but was fooled.
Well,
as
she
sort of-
believed that he was fooled, apparently, or that.
So either Martin was lying to
Right.
her,
Right, he might have been lying
saying
to
that
her.
he didn't,
He
saying
probably
that
was.
he thought it was of divine origin,
Right.
Or he was in on the scam and lying to her. One of the two.
Right.
Is that right?
But, I mean, we only can go by the records that we have.
Yeah.
And so we have the record of the lawsuit, and we have what Lucy said it was, but we don't actually, sometimes there's gaps in the record. So we know that, actually, Jesse Smith wrote about what was in the lawsuit. He mentioned it.
Okay.
So
So the pages get lost.
yeah, pages get lost. Lucy has the lawsuit, but she can't get Martin Harris himself to testify against Joseph Smith. So then the lawsuit fails because he's the main person she says is the victim. And it was kind of complicated, but but he loses the pages, and that's when they start putting in all the religious material. And Oliver Cowdery buys a King James Bible at the local bookstore, and then they start lifting stuff out of the King James Bible, verbatim, and figuring out the blueprint for this kingdom of God they're going to set up with the benign monarch as the ruler, the prophet, and they lay it all out. It's right in the Book of Mormon what they plan to do.
So the Book
So-
of Mormon is sort of not only a piece of history, but if you can get people to believe in the Book of Mormon as a religious record, and it prophesies Joseph Smith, which
Yeah.
it does,
Yeah.
and it prophesies a
It even-
church, which it does, the Book of Mormon's laying the groundwork for the church that you want to establish and the power that you want to try and coalesce.
Because Joseph Smith Sr. was quoted by the Vermonters that knew him that as saying, you could form a religion, and anybody, you preach it perseveringly for 50 years, and it'll be the religion of the country. Because he was estranged from the Masons and the Christians, so yeah, he had a motive to make up his own religion and start a group.
So do you think the Book of Mormon was written with the idea of eventually creating a church?
Well, yeah, that's what people. He apparently maybe had the idea back in Vermont, or at least, but he wasn't able to execute it, And Lucy was the one, it seems, according to observers, was the one pushing this idea of the Golden Book and the record, and Alvin didn't get to be the prophet, or he was designated early as being the prophet, but he got killed. So then Joseph.
Why not Hyrum instead of Joseph?
Well, because Hyrum. Well, we don't know.
Yeah.
Maybe, actually, Joseph Smith Jr. was a lot better public speaker than Hyrum, but Hyrum was the more learned one. He had attended all those classes in Vermont and at Dartmouth. But they collaborated on everything. They worked together.
Yeah, they were hand
Just-
in hand.
yeah.
And it makes sense that a lot of the theology that Hyrum would have learned at Dartmouth seems to make it into the Book of Mormon and into Joseph's early revelations and into a lot of the core Mormon theology. It's not distinctive. It's not
Yeah.
creative. It's borrowed from Dartmouth and, common and prevalent religious teachings at the time, which is just extra evidence that it's a 19th century document. Why would Nephi and Alma the Younger be talking about Jesus and be talking about baptism by immersion and priesthood authority. They wouldn't have even known that Jesus existed.
Right.
Right?
That was
Jews didn't even know that Jesus existed.
No, not in 600 AD.
600 BC.
BC, rather.
Right?
Yeah, right.
So it makes zero sense in the Book of Mormon that a bunch of Native Americans, before Christ is even born, are talking about baptism and priesthood and, authority and churches and Jesus and the atonement, right?
Right.
Because Jesus hadn't been born yet, right? That's a really huge gaping sort of anachronism, right?
But it appeals.
Forget horses and steel. The fact that this book, hundreds of years before Jesus is even born, is delving into Christian theology. That's like the biggest anachronism in all of the Book of Mormon.
It really is. Yeah. But it appealed to a lot of people who weren't very, educated about these things, because it was a way to kind of blend together some of the major thinking of the times.
And when you're writing fan fiction, why not write Christianity into Native Americans pre-zero?
Well, it was
It's
putting
kind of
a
fun,
Christian, so many people were joining churches in the Second Awakening, but then there's all the disaffected Masons. So you blend those two together and make a Masonic type group that had Christian language and was supposed to be from God, restored from ancient times. That was Sidney Rigdon's big idea, restoring the primitive church. But it doesn't restore what was in the Old New Testament. For instance, the temple. The temple was for a completely different purpose than the Masonic temples that they started really building.
Right.
But as soon as they got a chance.
So Sidney brings in this idea of a restoration of ancient Christianity. That's what gets Joseph thinking about polygamy and other things. Oh, if we have to restore all things, maybe we have to restore polygamy, because those girls look really good to me. But yeah, the temple is not a restoration, because it's actually just, Solomon had a temple, but Masons do temple work, and let's sort of make a reference to Solomon's temple, but really what we're just going to do is just co-opt in Mason temple ceremonies and call that the original Christianity, right?
Right. So they write the book. They took them over a year. Once they lost the 116 pages, then they started over and they put in the anti-Masonic stuff, and they put in the Christian material, the King James, and they put material from Rigdon sermons, and they put in, all predicting Joseph Smith and all the other sources that we can trace.
So there's the Old Testament and Isaiah. There's the New Testament, the Sermon on the Mount. There's Joseph's father's dream, which becomes Lehi's dream, right? Those are almost identical. The Joseph's, older brothers. Joseph is Nephi. The older brothers are his older brothers. There's Joseph's personal narrative, Joseph's father's dream that becomes Lehi's dream. There's the Old Testament and Isaiah, which becomes basically the foundation of Second Nephi, and all that Isaiah scripture quoting that goes on. That's also anachronistic, because we know that parts of Isaiah were written after Lehi would have left Jerusalem, right? And so that's highly anachronistic. We've got the errors that were in the Bible that Joseph and Hyrum had, making it into the Book of Mormon, which makes sense for why that's anachronistic and a problem. But then we've got all the sermons from not only Sidney Rigdon and all of that theology, but also all the theology from Dartmouth and all the theology from the burned over district, and all the sermons that were going on from all the Protestant ministers that Grant Palmer talks about. They're making it into the Book of Mormon, along with the anti-Masonic rhetoric that makes up all that stuff about secret combinations. And what am I forgetting? These are all the sources of the Book of Mormon that kind of get merged together.
So they're very creative, and they were some learned people in their circle. Sidney Rigdon was very learned on, So anyway, you just named all the sources. But
that doesn't mean Sidney had to have been involved. It could have just been Hyrum. It could have just been Oliver, Hyrum, and Joseph, right?
Right, or just... But the point was that they collaborated and they synthesized all these ideas together so that, I mean, they had multiple purposes. One, they could escape the law because it was starting to breathe down their neck with the Abner Cole and some of the other people that had been swindled. They could go out on the frontier and get followers. They could, but they really
It's
did,
a new business model.
yeah, new business model. And
Make money from a book and have the book predict a church and then start the church and then make money off the church.
They could get revenge on their probable enemies, the Masons, who had excluded Joseph Smith Sr. and had
Out-Mason the Masons.
yeah, they wanted to out-Mason the Masons. So they formed what they called, what people called Joseph's Lodge. And he wasn't the only one to do that. There were other people that wanted to merge Christianity with Masonry and spring up a new... this was early America where there were endless possibilities. There was this big frontier. There, they could go out and start something new. They had big dreams. Whoops, excuse me. That's water. It's just water. Big dreams. But you could be a political leader. He had seen that with the anti-Masonic party and former Third Party, and so he was gifted as a politician, Joseph Smith Jr. And then he had his brother Hyrum, who did a lot of the backup and he was more mature, more seasoned, more intellectual. So together as a family, they worked together as a team very well. And
then how do we make sense of this idea that the apologists and even the general authorities basically say the book had to have been written in, what do they say, 6 weeks or some crazy... You're telling me the book could have been written in 3 years. Why? How did the apologists have a leg to stand on when they try and claim that it was written in a much shorter period of time?
Well, Joseph Smith said that once, that he supposedly met Oliver Cowdery in May of 1829, and then the book was finished by June of 1829. So that, supposedly it only took 2 months. Well, they'd been working on it in the cave for a year, at least a year before that.
And you think Oliver was a part of that?
I think he was, because he was a scribe. He knew how to write. He wrote it. He wrote it all down. He lived nearby them. He was even thought, speculator. We have some reason to believe that he had helped William Morgan write down his book. So he had trained with his cousin Benjamin Franklin Cowdery, who was a newspaper man. He knew about printing. He was a peddler that went all over the Ohio Reserve. And so, yeah, he probably was... Well, and his parents had been, in counterfeiting, and they knew all the secret stuff. And by the way, his father was a Mason.
So do you think the book was basically Joseph, Hyrum, and Oliver?
And Lucy.
And Lucy.
Yeah, they met together and they got all the books from different sources and sermons.
Why do you think Joseph felt like he had to claim that he didn't meet Hyrum until 1829? Meet Oliver until 1829?
But that was later him telling about it, because
he wanted to bolster the idea that it was written by the gift and power of God, not authors.
Right.
So he needs to put Oliver coming in late so that he can't be
it was a pattern.
Claimed to be one of the authors.
It was a pattern that you see throughout the whole story. When you get, somebody calls you on something, and so you just make up a new story to cover that one up.
And you put it back in history.
Yeah, you put it back in history.
So like Joseph's credibility is being challenged in 1838, and authority is a really big deal. So he makes up the story of the Melchizedek priesthood and puts it back in time.
Right.
Right? To help. Or the first vision, all of a sudden he needs some claim for the origins of the church. So in 1832, he creates the story of the first vision and puts it back in time. And so some of these
Yeah.
founding events, no evidence of the first vision, no evidence of the Melchizedek priesthood ever being given, no date, no, even the people around Joseph at the time, they have no knowledge of discussing ever having Melchizedek priesthood be a part of it. Even one of the three witnesses, what was his name?
Martin Harris, David
The other
Whitmer,
one.
and
Whitmer's saying, I was with Joseph in the 1830s. We never talked about Melchizedek priesthood.
Yeah.
Right?
right.
He
That
writes
didn't come till
pamphlet.
later.
Joseph makes up later the idea of a Melchizedek priesthood and puts it back in the historical
Yeah,
record.
exactly.
So that's something that they did.
That's a pattern
And
that
you're saying
repeats
this-
itself over and over.
You're saying Joseph claiming that he didn't meet Oliver until 1829 was another example of them retrofitting history to fit
Yeah, because that was
whatever
in the history of the
emergency-
church that was written later. So,
Right.
and yeah,
Okay.
just to make it look more authentic, I guess, that they didn't have all the secret meetings that they admitted to later.
Got it.
Because Sidney Rigdon said they had a whole lot of secret meetings in the beginning. But of course, they're secret. They didn't write down those, but they wrote that they had them. But so supposedly he meets Oliver in May of 1829 and writes it in this 2-month period. Well, what probably happened is that Hyrum and Oliver and, whoever was writing it back in the cave, Joseph Smith has to go to Susquehanna County because he's being, quote, persecuted in it late of December 1827. But then they meet up together, all three of them, Martin Harris and Cowdrey and Hyrum and Joseph in Susquehanna County. And what probably happened is that they copied it. They made another printer's copy between May and June of 1829. So then it's ready for the printer. And then they find somebody to print it, Grandin. So 1829 is the period where they get the printer's copy, they find a printer, they are going to get a copy, they're going to sell the copyright in Canada, which to me was suspicious because why would they be able to sell a copyright for one thing? Why would they want to sell a copyright if it's from God? And and he even said it, some revelations are from the devil. Well, right across the border in Canada is where a lot of counterfeiting centers are. Maybe they went there to get counterfeit money.
But the point is, he's prophesying, he's telling these guys, oh, the Lord told me that you need to go sell this copyright and that you'll be successful if you go to Canada and do it. They go to Canada, they can't sell it.
Right.
And the whole question is, why are they even trying to sell the copyright to a book that's supposed to be scripture?
Went there to
right?
get counterfeit money. That's the
That's
cover.
what you think.
The revelation was that was the cover story.
But whether or not counterfeiting was involved,
Yeah.
the prophecy didn't come to pass.
No.
And it begs the question, why are they trying to sell it in the first place?
Right.
And why are his prophecies not coming to pass? And that goes back to this idea that for the decade prior, he had learned how to recover when a prophecy doesn't come to pass. So that becomes one of many prophecies he ends up making that doesn't come to pass, but it doesn't faze him or the religion because he's gotten really good at saying things like, well, some revelations are from God, some are from me, and some are from the devil, and I guess that one was not from God, right? And
Yeah.
that's with Zion's camp and other sorts of prophecies that didn't come to pass, Joseph gets really good. Oh, well, it's you. It was the chicken. It was it was your lack of righteousness. Oh, the people of Zion's camp weren't righteous, and that's why Zion's camp failed, right? It's
Right.
these methods he learns in his charlatan years
Yeah.
that he then bakes into his religion.
But I don't know if you know. Do you know Latane Scott? She wrote an essay on the whole method of obtaining truth in Mormonism is different than say Christians. Their idea of truth is always changing. They can always make up another story. This continuing revelation that continues today. is always changing. You know, you make up a new revelation to make up for the other one that didn't come true, or that somebody found a discrepancy in, and then you just keep going.
And that's part of the interesting, I don't want to say but paradox of Mormonism. The church is convinced all the members to believe that the gospel is unchanging, that it's unchanging from beginning to end, that it's Alpha and Omega, first and the last, the everlasting gospel, the fullness of the gospel that's unchanging. And yet, if there's
all the time.
Any marker of Mormon doctrine and theology, it's that it's always changing. Everything's changing.
Yeah.
It's like,
But
God and Jesus are one, and then God and Jesus are separate.
Yeah.
It's more Orthodox Christianity, and then all of a sudden men are becoming gods in the celestial kingdom. But now, no longer are we talking about men becoming gods. And then it's not polygamy, but then it's polygamy, but then they take polygamy away. And even in the early versions of the Doctrine and Covenants, polygamy is forbidden. And in the Book of Mormon, polygamy is forbidden. But then all of a sudden, polygamy is required for exaltation. And then you fast forward another 100 years, and the government makes us stop doing polygamy. And then all of a sudden, we don't really stop it. We tell everyone we stop it, but we keep doing it. But then we have to have a second manifesto where we say, okay, this time we really mean it. We really are going to stop polygamy. But then we still believe in it. And then fast forward to the 80s, 1980s, 90s. Oh, polygamy is not doctrinal. We don't practice it. It's just that really weird thing that those FLDS people do. And even though Dallin H. Oakes and Russell and Nelson have polygamy, are sealed to polygamous wives, somehow they're still convincing all of us that polygamy is no longer what Mormons do. That's what those crazy people in Short Creek do.
It's not.
And yet it's the unchanging everlasting covenant that's never changed.
It's enough to drive you. I mean, literally, it's not good for your mental health.
But members are just the gospel's everlasting and nothing ever changes.
It's because they put all their faith and trust in those leaders that are telling you that, so they can do no wrong. And that's what happened early on.
If the leaders say it's never changing, it's never changing. If the leaders say it's true, it's true.
Right. They can see for themselves that it's ever changing, but they are told that it's not changing, so they have to hold those two contradictory ideas in their mind.
But what they really do is they just don't think about it. What did the leaders say today? Okay, that's true. I mean, that's what it comes down to.
Right.
What's true is what the leader's saying today.
But that's how it was.
I know, anything the scriptures say or that past leaders said is kind of expendable, because what we're really attuned to is modern authority.
Right.
Current prevailing authority.
That is not the case in Christian churches, and I can say that.
The Bible, what the Bible actually says matters to evangelical Christians.
And it's timeless.
And that goes back to the battle between the Pilgrims and the Puritans at the very beginning of this whole story, right?
Right, yep.
So let's talk about really quickly, you've got in your outline how they pulled off starting a church. So what do you want to say about that?
Well, they needed an escape hatch, for one thing, to escape the law and go out somewhere beyond the frontier. And that's what radical
So you're saying that their charlatan stuff through 1826 starts to catch up with them.
And by the time they left, they formed the church,
where?
Manchester, New York.
Okay.
Now there's a conflicting story there. Was the first meeting of the church started in Fayette, New York, which was in Seneca County, or did it start in Manchester? Well, Michael Marquardt determined that the first meeting of it was really in Manchester, even though later they claimed that it was in Fayette. Well,
but either way, you're saying that they can't stay in Palmyra. Why?
Well, because the Masons started really coming down on them. I mean, well, and that and their debtors, their creditors.
All the scams that they had done, they owed a bunch of money, people felt defrauded of their money.
Right, Abner Cole started publishing excerpts of the Book of Mormon in the Reflector, so now people are knowing about their money digging, more inside details that only he would have, he could tell about it because he knew from the inside. So Abner Cole started publishing that, he's claiming to be a biblical prophet. Well, he was a money digger and he swindled these people out of this, and this is the methods he used, and so.
And this is really important. I'm sorry to be interrupting, but this is so important because growing up, you hear about that adversity in the church in those New York years, and the way you're primed to think about it is, oh, well, Joseph was bringing forth the Book of Mormon, so Satan and his angels all wanted to fight, the Lord's holy work. And so all that adversity where he's running around carrying this 150-pound gold plates with one arm and fighting off other people with his other arm, and all that adversity that was running, all that was a product of Satan just trying to keep the Book of Mormon from coming to be. You're saying that all that real adversity that they were facing in New York
was the people trying to call them to account, and
people super pissed off for losing all their money, for being cheated, for being swindled.
And this was a pattern that they had learned from Stephen Burrows, because he always claimed that he was persecuted when people tried to call him to account. So there it was, an example of someone that always cried persecution. They're in a most unchristian fashion, and the Masons did that too. They said when the anti-Masons tried to call them to account for the William Morgan murder, they said, "Oh, we're being persecuted. You're being unchristian. You're just coming down on us when we did nothing." And, they denied it.
And really what was happening was all the people who had lost all that money, who had been fooled, their reputation had become fully soured. All that fraud, all that illegal activity for all those years was really starting to catch up with the Smith family.
Right.
And they needed an out.
Yeah.
But they had created this book that they believed was going to start getting traction.
Right, and the Masons couldn't openly, accuse them because they were under fire themselves. But they were afraid that this Book of Mormon was going to be a competition or,
A threat in some way.
Right, so the head of the Masons starts prosecuting Hyrum Smith for debt, just like they had done to William Morgan. And there's a lawsuit, Levi Daggett versus Hyrum Smith. So he starts coming down on him. You got to pay my money back. They put Joseph Smith Sr.
By the way, we haven't mentioned yet that Hyrum's original name was spelled how?
Hiram.
Which is a spelling that's identical to the name used where and how.
Well, Hyrum is a Masonic name. There's Hiram Abiff, who was one of the main characters of the Masonic legend.
Which is a key central figure in the whole Mason narrative.
Right.
And that's how Hyrum's name was originally spelled, which suggests that Joseph Smith Sr. was somehow influenced by Masonry from the very start.
He probably really aspired to be a Mason early in Vermont, but he wasn't. He was excluded.
He was too disreputable. But Hyrum ends up changing the spelling of his name.
As of 1826, right when the anti-Masonic movement starts.
He changes it to Hyrum.
Exactly.
Which is interesting. Okay, so we go back. Now the Masons have turned on him. Hyrum's fleeing the Mason
They're
persecution.
afraid that it's going to be a competition or some other, So they file a lawsuit, Hyrum versus Levi Daggett, and then they put Joseph Smith Sr. in jail, in the same jail that William Morgan had been in, for a whole month for a $4 debt, which was way beyond what is was customary. So Lucy describes in her history, she does describe how Dr. McIntyre, the head of the Masons, sends people to her house demanding repayment of the debt. And there's this whole huge number of people that are knocking at the door and looking for Hyrum. And there's a letter that says, "Beware of the Freemasons, they're looking for you, Hyrum," from Joseph Smith to Oliver Cowdery, or to Hyrum in Susquehanna County. So you can piece together that they were under fire from people in Palmyra for both being swindlers and for maybe, this potential
threat to the Masons.
Competitive group with the Masons. So Lucy's beside herself with her husband in jail. Joseph and Hyrum are off in Susquehanna County, and
Writing
or
the book.
they take off for their, yeah. So she gathers a whole bunch of their followers, the Rockwells and some other cousins, and this is after they've. Oh, well, she gathers a group anyway, and she takes them off to Seneca County, Fayette, New York, and they eventually meet up with each other. But so they went to this place called Hyrum, Ohio, and that's when we definitely know that they met up with Cindy Rigdon at that time. But they start issuing revelations right away. Well, I skipped a part about, Joseph Smith started preaching from the Book of Mormon in Susquehanna County, right where he had been arrested before for being disorderly person and imposter. Now the other surrounding, the Presbyterians and some other people know that they knew he was a swindler from before, so they prosecute him for the same thing again, but it's not as easy to prove that you're perpetrating religious fraud. Now that he's got this Book of Mormon, and it seems to be fairly Christian. It doesn't have a lot of the later doctrines that he comes up with in it. The Book of Mormon is actually fairly Orthodox Christian. It says God is a spirit, not a man with flesh and bones. It says, there's nothing in there about organizing the universe out of, materials that are already there instead of coming out of nothing. And
that's another huge smoking gun. The Book of Mormon doesn't
Yeah.
mention baptisms for the dead.
No,
It
temples.
doesn't mention temple marriage. It doesn't
No.
mention temples at all. It doesn't mention the endowment. It doesn't mention the celestial kingdom and the 3 degrees of glory. Like all of and it's against polygamy. Like if the Book of Mormon was like this, a really important book that had the fullness of the gospel that God just couldn't wait for all of his members to have because the Bible was messed up. And so we've got to provide the right book that replaces that corrupt Bible, right? You would think, and it was going to be engraven in plates for generations, for 1,000 years, and then saved and stored up for the coming of the final days, and then it's released, and it's basically warmed over, Protestant theology
Yeah.
that Joseph was believing, along with Hyrum, that Hyrum had learned in Dartmouth. It
Right.
was just all that very predictable Protestant theology that Joseph and Hyrum and Sidney and Oliver were swimming in at the time.
But they needed to sound fairly Christian at the time because so many people were joining churches.
The book provides
Just-
legitimacy.
Right.
It's always the book that provides legitimacy.
Yeah.
And it becomes a cover. And this is something that's so relevant to today, because if you want to, be a drug lord or a forger and commit fraud, you're going to go to jail. But if you want to manipulate a lot of people to make a crap ton of money, you call it a religion and you're protected by the Constitution. And all of a sudden, religion becomes this tax shelter where you're not paying any taxes. And then you can almost do whatever you want as long as you can sort of retreat to religious persecution, we're being harmed. It becomes this perfect way to get super rich and powerful. Religion
Well,
does.
if you get a lot of followers and have an appealing message, and there are honest churches that don't do that preach from the Bible and are pretty poor.
And they're all dying.
Well,
No, I'm just being,
Yeah.
I'm being a little bit sarcastic, but
It-
yes, I'm not saying all churches are evil, but I'm saying
Yeah.
religion provides the perfect cover
it can.
for abuse and
But there's other
profiteering.
covers too. Gamblers always had their,
Yeah, mob has its legitimate business.
exactly.
Right, yeah.
So,
Okay, so they start, so you're saying
So-
that it started not in Palmyra, but it started elsewhere.
well, Joseph Smith started issuing revelations in 1828 to Martin Harris because,
He needs their money.
It-
He needs his money.
well, yeah, and for some reason, we don't know if he was in on it or not, or if he just really liked Joseph Smith's authority. I think he was in on it, and it was just a cover to he started issuing these revelations. Maybe that was a retrofitted backward. You got to mortgage your farm and get us the $3,000 to print the Book of Mormon. So they, and you get
I'll
to
just
do
tell
that.
you my opinion. You know how like Joseph didn't tell everyone about polygamy, even in his inner circle? There were,
Right.
William Law, he didn't say, hey, William Law, I'm doing this polygamy thing and it's awesome, right? Right?
Well, he probably knew about
He
it.
said that to Brigham Young for some reason, but he didn't say that to William Law. William Law, when he found out, even though he was in the first presidency, when he found out, he left the church and started the Nauvoo Expositor and exposed Joseph Smith. So
Right.
I'm just saying there's this idea
Right.
of an inner circle and an inner circle, right?
Yeah.
And I get the sense, it's my opinion, that maybe Hyrum was on the inner circle, and maybe Oliver was in the inner circle, but maybe Martin was on that next circle out where he was still believing in Joseph's authority and power. And so Joseph was using the revelation to manipulate him. And that's why when
Yeah.
Martin Harris, when the three witnesses actually went out to have their special, gift and power of God, second sight experience with the angel Moroni, the first two witnesses saw whatever vision immediately, but Martin was like, I didn't see it. Help me see it, right?
Right.
And then Joseph has to help whip up some sort of vision that Martin can then believe in. That, to me, that would make more sense, along with the idea that Martin had to have that revelation before he would give the money. And, this is just my theory.
But you can drive yourself crazy trying to figure out who knew what, when they knew it exactly, because
Yeah. Who's in on it, who's not.
like what was the real story versus what was the cover story. All you know is that there's conflicting stories, people, and you have to piece it together by what people said at the time that they said it and the surrounding circumstances when they said it. So that was when the prophet role was born, when he was giving revelations supposedly to Martin Harris that you got to mortgage your farm. And so that worked really well. They found out to, be...
Say God said it.
Yeah, God said it, so now we got to do this. And he gave revelations when the day that the church was formed, April 30th, 1830, he gave revelations to his brother even. You should not feel under condemnation. Thus saith the Lord that this is going to all be fine. And so we have those revelations given on that day, and then we have, they started collecting the revelations into the Book of Commandments, which later became the Doctrine and Covenants. And when you look at those the early Book of Commandments, you see in there even evidence about talking about mineral rods, that he gives a revelation to Oliver Cowdery. Oh, and you have the gift of the rod, which they took that out later, but even that it referred back to, there's money digging scams.
It seemed like so many of those early Joseph revelations was like, I need your money, I need your land, I need you to go do this thing for me,
Exactly.
and you're going to be a lot more willing to do whatever I need you to do if I say that God told me to tell you to do it.
Right.
And those early revelations are kind of mundane. It's like, get me a ham and cheese sandwich. God said, get me a turkey pot pie. I mean, that's the flavor of those early revelations, right? Isn't it?
Right, and they revised them later, of course.
Right. And they became more and more about theology and authority later on. But early on, Revelation seemed to be Joseph's way of getting people to do what he wanted them to do.
Exactly. And early on in 1831, when he joins up with Sidney Rigdon, before they even were in Kirtland, they were still in Hyrum, they come up with the revelation of the 3 degrees in heaven. And that changes everything to do with Christianity, because, they do away with in faith alone, in Christ alone, in Scripture alone, by grace alone. So they already, they had already moved away from Protestant Christianity, but they made it seem like they were putting the stamp of God on everything they did. And the kingdom of God, they were going to build this big city and the temple. Christians don't build temples. they go by the scripture. Christ said he was going to destroy the temple, and sure enough, it was destroyed in 70 AD. And he said, we don't need temples anymore. You are my temple. So they wanted to make people work for their salvation by doing his commands early on. That was one of their first brilliant ideas that they borrowed from Masonry. Now you're going to work up your ways in degrees, not only in this life, but in the afterlife. You got to work up to a
And even, by the way, there's 3 main degrees of Masonry,
right?
3 degrees of glory, and then in Masonry, for each of the degrees, there's a handshake and a penalty. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I don't think we've fully absorbed the idea that even the 3 degrees of glory, along with the signs and the penalties, that's all rewarmed Masonry,
Yeah.
right? It's not revelation.
And it comes out
it's borrowed Masonry.
Well, and it comes out of counterfeiting, because in the counterfeiting rings, you had your secret signs, you had your secret code words, because you couldn't reveal to somebody that the counterfeit money was on its way if they weren't in their network. You could go
You
to
needed
jail.
signs and tokens and
You had signs of recognition, secret passwords, secret codes, and
But that could be Masonry without the need for counterfeiting, right? Because it's all in Masonry.
it's all in
Signs,
Masonry.
tokens, penalties, secret oaths,
But
blood
the,
oaths.
the anti-Masons accused the Masons of counterfeiting money too, and using their secret network as a means to
So
do
it's
counterfeiting.
all cultural artifacts that make their way into counterfeiting and Masonry, right? Blood oaths,
Well,
secret
yeah,
handshakes,
it
penalties.
was their methods. It was their
Yeah.
secret methods.
right.
Yeah.
So let me just see if I can try and summarize a little bit. So they create the book, but time's running out because in Palmyra, they're getting persecuted, they're getting put in jail, they're getting incarcerated. So they have to flee, and this becomes their pattern, fleecing a bunch of people, causing a bunch of trouble, breaking a bunch of laws, and then moving to the next town, right?
Because people are calling them to account. They're onto them. So they got to
And
go
that's
to the next.
Palmyra. That then becomes Kirtland. That then becomes Independence, Missouri. That then becomes Nauvoo, and then that eventually becomes Salt Lake.
Yep.
It's not that Satan is chasing them. It's that these are charlatans who are breaking laws and stealing from people. And in each time, there's sort of a countdown where that ends up catching up with them, and they've got to flee to the next town, to the next town, to the next town. Because eventually these methods of fooling people always catch up with them in every town they go to. And that's why they left New York. That's why they went to Ohio.
And when you read the accounts of the people who participated in driving them out of places, they always said, we didn't care if they had strange doctrines or strange beliefs. We absolutely didn't care about that. We cared if they were law-abiding people. But the anti-Mormons, like in Missouri and in Nauvoo especially, they went through legal means. They had town meetings. They met with the mayor. They met with the governor. They met with the authorities that were there and said, this is what's happening. We don't care about their strange beliefs. We just don't want them stealing and robbing and passing counterfeit money on us. So, this cry of persecution was just a means to get away with their crimes, and because they were religious.
Right. So do you have a theory about Sidney Rigdon's role? Because obviously, and we're not going to go all through Nauvoo per se, but Kirtland becomes the first place they try and really form a real legitimate church.
Well,
do you think Sidney Rigdon was in on the con, or do you think he was in the outer circle,
I think he was in. Oh, he was definitely.
You think he was on the inner circle of the con?
Yeah, Sidney and Smith were very closely working together. In fact, Oliver Cowdery said once Sidney Rigdon really became the main preacher of Mormonism, then I kind of wasn't his best buddy anymore. And he was a polished, gifted preacher. I mean, he could enthrall a crowd, and he was one of the most eloquent preachers around. But Joseph Smith really employed him and made it sound like Christian teaching, and
And he already had a congregation that he had developed in Kirtland, right?
He already did, but he was also
So it's an
connected.
efficient, quick way to start a church,
Yeah,
right?
because he already had 100 followers or more. He was very connected with Masonry as well, though. His brothers were Royal Arch Masons,
Sidney Rigdon.
Yes, and he went back to Masonry when he went to Pennsylvania. And when at his funeral, the Masons gave him a very honorary Masonic funeral, and they said, very complimentary things about him starting Mormonism, even. So that's interesting.
Right.
But he was very trained in the secret methods too, and then he really was a little too outspoken at some points for Joseph Smith's taste.
But what's important to note is that Kirtland becomes the fulfillment of kind of the second phase of that original scheme or plan. In other words, we're going to make the book, but then we're going to start a offshoot of Masonry.
That's when they really get the
where it's going to be a church, and I'm going to be a prophet, and we're going to build temples and have a replacement ritual. And if you look at the Kirtland Temple, it reminds you of a Masonic lodge, doesn't it, on the inside?
Well, it was also modeled kind of after the buildings in Dartmouth. Back in, they modeled it after some of their buildings back there that Hyrum had known about. And
but it's clearly that first experimentation. I mean, if Joseph had been talking to God, God would have made in Kirtland the same temple that we have today. But instead, it was this morphing of like Christian stuff and the Mason ceremony, but they hadn't come up with the 3 degrees of glory stuff yet. They hadn't come up with the endowment yet. And so we find in Kirtland some weird newer evolvement.
I think that the 3 degrees of glory was 1831. I'm pretty sure. I have to look that up, but it was pretty early.
Okay.
Because they wanted people working to get up to that highest heaven.
But that hadn't been baked into the endowment ceremony yet, right?
No.
And the idea of men becoming gods and eternal marriage and all that stuff.
No.
That came later.
They wanted to build a temple, and the first one in Kirtland, they didn't know quite what to do with, actually.
Right.
They didn't, because the revelation that you had to pay 10% of your income in tithing didn't come till 1838. So they didn't think of that yet. But that really was the means by which, they were able to make it money-making.
And that, all the Kirtland scandal was about them trying to fund, right, the temple and all those innovations that they wanted to do.
They experimented, and
that's when they create the bank and the fake currency, right?
Well, yeah, that's a whole story in itself. The whole anti-bank.
Right.
They went into huge debt building the temple, and people were donating 10% of their labor to the temple, so they must have gotten some idea there. But Joseph Smith had been to New York and seen the Masonic temples there, and wrote a letter back to Emma saying, "Wow, they sure have some nice buildings here and temples and things." So, and the temple had to do with land speculation as well. The way to really make money on land speculation was the government would sell the land at a low price to these people, these speculators who would buy big tracts of land, who had enough money to do that. And then they would sell it as the population went up for higher and higher prices. So if you had something to attract some people to your place, like a temple, like it was going to be the kingdom of God, then you could get people to pay a lot of money for those lots that are right in the downtown near the temple area. So he did that in Kirtland. He started, there with that scheme. And it all collapsed because they really went overboard, and there was nothing to build the economy on. They didn't do much farming, really. They donated their labor for the temple, but they hadn't figured out how to get to people to come to it, And then they were in huge debt, so they had to, they had to start an anti-bank, what they called. And that was that's a whole long story. I don't know how much you want me to tell of that.
Yeah. Well, so we've gone 3 hours and 15 minutes just kind of straight. And, I'll just, and maybe we'll grab lunch and then we'll finish or something. But what we're trying to do here is something that I don't think has been done. We need our best historians and our best scholars and our best thinkers to put together reasonable timelines for different theories on how things happen, when they happen, what the sources are. Because I think we've got enough information to put together a pretty plausible story of how the restoration happened. And so this becomes one attempt at starting to put together that timeline, starting to understand it, trying to get really solid on the details. Because I think you can kind of reverse engineer from the historical evidence that we have a pretty good explanation for when things happened, how they happened, and what the sources are for everything that we've got. And I just think this is a worthwhile exercise for those who are trying to really nail down the truth claims or lack of truth claims that kind of have shaped our lives for generations.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, I have seen, as I was doing this, the potential for a lot more research, to fill in details where you could probably find out more exactly. But I wanted to do a whole scope of how the counterfeiting, and the swindling and all the secrecy and oaths and everything formed the basis all along. And the same patterns kept repeating. So you could go into more depth, for instance, on what exactly happened with Oliver Harper, or how, in Susquehanna County, exactly more details on what, or the exact details of how they, when they, more about the Gold Bible Company, or so forth. But when you see the repeating patterns of how they did things in the counterfeiting culture of the times, and you can do more to, you can see that it was spurious from the beginning, and it was organized crime. You have to say, they were organized criminals. I mean, they were doing illegal stealing, counterfeiting, everything, from before the Book of Mormon.
And what about the idea that of this pious fraud? That yes, Joseph was doing sketchy things, but he believed he was communicating with God. He believed that he had the gift and power of God. Maybe he was aware that he was engaging in some deceptive practices, but he also believed his own press, and maybe even those around him, maybe even Hyrum, maybe even Emma, simultaneously knew that they were involved in a scheme, but also believed he had some power. Is that in your realm of?
Well, Dan Vogel's theory is that he was a, quote, pious fraud. But in my book, knowing how these things are two contradictory things, you can't be pious and a fraud at the same time. Not if you're pious and you believe in just something as simple as 10 Commandments. I mean, 10 Commandments, don't lie, cheat, steal, or commit adultery. That's being pious.
But that's the lower law. What if your theory is there's a higher law?
Well, that's what the radical sect prophets always referred to, the quote, higher law. Well, no.
I'm just saying, could he have, you're saying that's not legitimate Christianity. I'm
Right.
saying, could in Joseph's mind, he's engaging in fraudulent behaviors, thinking that God's wanting that? Because if you look at the Bible, there's all sorts of crazy, weird things that are happening that God's behind.
Well,
God's behind killing people. God's behind genocide. God's behind killing animals and babies. God's behind sending floods to kill everybody. Like, God's doing all sorts of sketchy, crazy, he's having weird people sleep together. like. So, I mean, if you really take the Bible seriously, it gives you the idea of a God that will do anything.
Well, I've really studied the Bible. And, I've studied hundreds of books and studied all different philosophies, religions. I've studied them my whole life.
Please tell me the Old Testament disturbs you. The God of the Old Testament disturbs you.
Well, life is disturbing. I mean, I believe there's one true story of the origin of the earth, of life. They can't all be true at the same time. So you have to figure out what you believe on that issue. There's a lot of disturbing, yes, there's disturbing stories I mean, do you want me to tell me my beliefs? But where were we going?
I was just saying the Old Testament's disturbing.
Okay.
And the God of the Old Testament's disturbing. And if Joseph really believed in that disturbing God, which he seemed to have, then he could justify even murder if he felt like God was commanding him, right? If he's basically confusing his own emotions with God, right?
Well,
And then his emotions are saying, have sex with that 14-year-old, or, steal from these people, or lie about this, cover it up. In essence, if he's equating his feelings with God, and his understanding of God is a God that will kill women and children and genocide and all these problems, then I'm just saying I could see Dan Vogel's theory that Joseph is doing crazy stuff, but he's believing that God is informing his emotions, which then are the basis for this disturbing behavior.
well, that is not how I saw
How do you see it?
Dan Vogel's theory.
Okay.
Because he got it from another man, I forget his name now, but I could look it up. He said that his theory was that Joseph Smith was defending God in an age of skepticism. So yeah, I guess he could have convinced himself that he was doing, but I mean, it says right in the Bible, if you defend God using deceit, then you're sinning. I mean, it's not legitimate to use deceit. Throughout the Bible, it says that. And if you believe in the God of the Bible, which is an all-powerful, all-knowing, omniscient, eternal God that created the world out of nothing, that's different than the whole thesis of the Bible is that God determines what is good, not man. And there's this eternal law that nobody reaches except for Jesus. And then, so all the prophets and all the people in the Bible were falling short of God's standard, which is the law. So it's a completely different Christianity. And yes, it is man's duty to be as honest and be as obedient to the law as is possible, especially with the, if you turn your life to Christ, and then he will guide you into being free of your sins. And so if you're a Puritan, for instance, your battle is against sin. And you're not going to be pious by doing illegal, deceptive, murderous things. So pious and fraud, in my book, do not go together. You would not use fraud to defend the God of the Bible.
Right, and that's your belief. And I'm just speculating, wondering whether, because Joseph was a different type of category of Christian altogether, whether in his mind, in Hyram's mind, in Emma's mind, yes, they were fooling people, but maybe God was telling Joseph that they should be doing all these things. And they all, Joseph included, somehow maybe even believed that God was directing their efforts.
Well, he might have deceived himself into thinking. When I studied criminals, I studied a lot of criminals of the 19th century. I saw a similar pattern. They would start out doing small crimes. They would get more and more adept at getting away with crimes. And they would deceive themselves into thinking that this was okay, and then they would actually be proud of their crimes. They brag about them in books, as if as if it weren't, as if it were legitimate. They started out in a career just like a legitimate career. They get better and better at getting away with stuff. And they convince themselves that they're doing something fine, okay.
And that's what I'm wondering. I'm curious. I'd be curious if I could go back and really ask questions and get the truth. I'd want to know whether Joseph believed he was really getting his commandments from God. And I'd be curious to know if Emma and Hyrum and the others, Oliver and Sidney, maybe knew at some level they weren't always being honest or truthful, but at some level believed that God was somehow influencing Joseph and the direction of their movement. Well, you could read
what Joseph L. Jackson said at the end of his career. In 1844, Joseph L. Jackson wrote in his adventures, in his narrative, he said, Joseph Smith was so adept and so used to using duplicity that it didn't even bother him anymore at all. When he said that when Joseph Smith commissioned him, Joseph L. Jackson, to go and murder the former governor of Missouri, Wilburn Boggs, and it was a commandment of God that was, that he should do this, he said it with no compunction, no guilt, nothing. But that was murder. That was sending someone to murder someone.
I thought that was Porter Rockwell.
Well, Porter Rockwell had been commissioned earlier than that and had failed to complete the deed. So Jackson said that Smith hired him to finish it off.
Okay.
Under the command of God. But he started thinking of himself as a god, because nobody crossed him. I mean, in Nauvoo, you could really see it. He started thinking he could do no wrong. Well, and that was the Royal Arch oath. I support, my leader, right or wrong, under penalty of death. You weren't supposed to even try to discern what was right and wrong anymore. And that was the Danite oath. You swear allegiance to Joseph Smith, whether right or wrong. So, he thought he could commit no wrong. And that's what the fundamentalists believe today, that Warren Jeffs can do no wrong. He's the God, he's the prophet that they worship. He's speaking for God, and they don't even know what they're committing is crimes. They don't even know that they're committing crimes with seducing young girls or there's proof that evidence that they're counterfeiting money today or defrauding the welfare system or whatever, because they can do no wrong. They don't even know what a crime is.
And so what I sense from this final bullet 7 of your outline and the theology evolving is that early Mormonism was kind of more close to traditional 19th century Christianity. And I imagine that you would paint sort of the Nauvoo time period as Joseph really taking Mormonism away from traditional Christianity and probably by your estimation kind of perverting a more true form of Christianity. Is that right?
Yeah, well, the whole Protestant Reformation was built on the idea that the Bible is the ultimate authority and the literal Word of God. That was not the belief in the Catholic Church, who said that the authority is in the Pope. So it's where your locus of authority lies. Joseph Smith said, I'm the authority. You believe me. From the beginning, he wanted to be the ultimate authority. You believe my revelations over anything else, over, taking away authority from the Bible. So, but he couldn't do that very well at first because of the Second Awakening, because the anti-Masons objected to Masonry on Christian grounds. They wanted to stay Orthodox Christian and based on the Bible and the Christian There were honest preachers who knew the original languages of the Bible and taught the actual text of what the Bible says. And then, but Joseph Smith, sounded Christian at first, and the Book of Mormon's basically Protestant Christian. But then, as time went on, he needed more, especially in Nauvoo. He had all these followers. He was coming under fire for counterfeiting and for polygamy and for other crimes. So he needed to come up, just like he had with money digging, well, I better come up with a better story and divert their attention from all this corruption that's going on. So the Mormonism is based on the King Follett sermon more than any other.
Modern Mormon theology.
Well, as of Nauvoo, yeah, as of the King Follett sermon, that was what Mormonism became. Of course, it had already had the temples and so forth before that, but the King Follett sermon comes up with the idea that God the Father was once a man, and that you can evolve into being a God yourself if you just do enough temple rituals, and the idea that the universe was organized instead of created out of nothing. And the idea of the apostates are sons of perdition, that's in the King Follett sermon. And so I thought it was really interesting that Joseph Smith, had already discredited the Bible. He said it's not translated correctly, and there's parts that are missing. And,
Book of Mormon's better.
right. But then in the King Follett sermon, he claims that everything he's saying about the doctrines that I just mentioned that contradict the Bible, he tries to say that those are in the Bible because he was coming under such fire. Now he's got to put religious legitimacy on his act. He's got to come up with something to divert all that attention because his enemies were becoming stronger, political enemies, especially when he was running for president. They really found that to be a threat. And
he has himself crowned king of the world, right?
Right. He has
he's
this
really off his
4,000-man
rocker.
army, and people are really worried about that. They think he's going to do some murderous design, as they said. And his inner circle officers, including William Law, Wilson Law, and the other publishers of the
Nauvoo Expositor.
Nauvoo Expositor, were going to the authorities telling about the inner circle counterfeiting and horse thieving. And he was going to get in real bad trouble for that. And it was a lot of the evidence about the counterfeiting and horse thieving and treason, plan to take over the whole West with the 4,000-man army that they planned in the Council of 50. That was what really convinced his enemies, the anti-Mormons, the governor, and all the, an alliance of authorities that he had to be taken down. And they couldn't have, he couldn't have gone to a fair trial because it was so politicized by that time. And, the law said he had to be tried in Hancock County. Well, Hancock County had mostly Mormons in it. And the anti-Mormons, that he could have gotten his Mormon followers to testify on his behalf. So anyway, in some ways, I even saw a law that said if somebody that is charged with a felony resists arrest, then the law officer is justified in shooting them. So, and that's what happened. He resisted arrest. Joseph Smith put Nauvoo under martial law to avoid being arrested. So then but he had to come back anyway. And that's a whole long other story, but he ended up going to Carthage jail. But Thomas Ford, the governor, was going to come and bring, he wanted to call out the state militia to surround the Mormons, as had been done in Missouri, but he didn't have the resources. He only had a militia with 1,700 people instead of 4,000. So it would have been a massive bloodbath civil war had they gone to war with each other. So there were a league of people that wanted to have Joseph and Hyrum assassinated, but it was because they were under legal charge of multiple crimes, including treason, including counterfeiting, and theft.
And polygamy.
And polygamy, and it wasn't, the polygamy was one part of it. It was the other crimes that were...
And destroying the printing press and violating the Constitution and the freedom of speech, right?
Right.
That was a little bit problematic. Yeah.
But John Taylor heard the rumors of the governor coming in to investigate the counterfeiting charges, and so he disguised himself. He hid the press. Why did he need to do that if they weren't doing illegal things with it? But it was serious to be counterfeiting money and stealing horses. It was a capital crime because you needed your horse out on the frontier, and the counterfeiting was a serious thing that you could hang for. So he got very skilled in deception early on, and but the church was a way to get political power, make money, out-mason the Masons.
Have sex with lots of women.
Sex with lots of women. Well, and do you want to talk about that, too, the polygamy and how that was connected with?
We always want to talk about polygamy.
Well, I was really fascinated to find out that the major counterfeiting rings, and Stephen Burrows was not the only major counterfeiting head, CEO-like head of a major ring. There was there was a man named John Morrell too, who had a large following, and then there was James Brown, who was right in Kirkland, Ohio. But when you study the patterns of those early counterfeiting rings, they would intermarry with each other so that anybody in the family wouldn't go to the major authorities. So members of families would not betray each other to the outside authorities, whereas a lot of other people might. So in Nauvoo, Joseph Smith started marrying all these women, starting with Beeman. What's her first name?
Eliza? No?
Louisa Beeman, yeah. In 1842, after he had met up with John C. Bennett, who was also a total scoundrel, he was probably in counterfeiting as well. He did a lot of frauds on people. But they must have determined that this was a way to bind their already secretly oath-bound inner circle men in loyalty to Smith. Because it was after that he started marrying all these women. And so, and the one, Catherine Davis did a study on all the women who he married, and the thing that went through as a theme was, you need to be loyal to me. You need to know that I'm a prophet, and not go to, because you couldn't go on the outside if you were married to more than one wife and she had borne you children, especially. And Klaus Hansen said polygamy was the way that Joseph Smith bound his inner circle men to himself. You could not survive on the outside. You could not leave. If you're married to more than one woman, it was socially unacceptable and it was illegal. So that's why, you wonder, why did he take that risk? Because that was a pretty risky thing to do, marry all these women in secret, when he's supposed to be a Christian, pious pastor.
Right.
But it was from his counterfeiting background, and it was a way so nobody could leave.
So you're saying possibly the idea for polygamy came from counterfeiting culture?
Yeah, and it stands to reason, you can't, nobody can go out on the outside and
binds people into
take your two wives.
Right. But he wasn't having children with these wives. There weren't a lot of children coming out of the marriages.
Well, that's in question. There are some that think that there are certain ones are
but
children.
DNA tests haven't really substantiated a lot of biological children between Joseph.
No,
and-
not a lot, but maybe one or two,
Maybe.
they're in question. But
But you're just saying the
John
fact
C.
that,
Bennett was an abortionist too.
Right.
But the idea wasn't
but then the children aren't
necessary-
binding everyone together if they're having abortions.
right. But just the marriage, the idea wasn't necessarily a lot of sex and children. It was to get the loyalty. And that's why
And Joseph referred to that
You know.
as like the dynastic sealing. It's like the covenant, the new and everlasting covenant.
yeah,
You know,
he
binding
covered all over with religious
from beginning
language.
to the end, binding people together, father to son, son
But
to,
for instance, Helen Mar Kimball, the 14-year-old daughter of Heber C. Kimball. Now, why did he have to give her to him? It was so that he would be sure that he wouldn't turn on him, and Yeah.
For you, you're saying, even though Joseph shrouded polygamy and sealings in this language of connecting generations, you're saying the practical motive was
Yeah.
binding the inner circle together so that he could have more power and control.
yeah.
And I think that's how it played
And so they
out.
wouldn't go to the outside authorities, which some of them actually ended up doing after all anyway. William Law wouldn't buy into the polygamy. Joseph L. Jackson wouldn't buy into the polygamy. And sure enough, they were the ones, that ended up turning state's evidence, and a whole group of them did. They weren't willing to go along with that. That was just too far out there. William Law didn't want to give his wife to Joseph Smith, and that was a major problem. They were trying to kill William Law, according to him, years later, but they didn't succeed.
And you're basically saying that all that idea was probably inspired by marriage activities, polygamous activities that were common in several counterfeiting groups that you studied.
Yeah, there were polyandry and the polygamy happened in the counterfeiting groups. So,
Prior to 1840s.
yeah.
Okay. Interesting. That's interesting.
Well,
All right.
and among some of these radical sects too, there was,
So I think this will end up being a 4-parter, a 4-hour series. We could, and I started by saying we could have you on, and so many of the chapters in this book deserve their own hour because there's so much incredible depth. If you look through this book, you'll see writing and stars on every single page. I found this book to be, for me, groundbreaking. You'll have to decide if for yourself it is, but this book's amazing. The way that I want to end our conversation today, that's been a little more freeform and less structured than is normal for me, but I've still enjoyed it. I want to talk about your beliefs. So, actually, I want to talk about 2 things. So, can you accept? I'll just call it a light criticism in good spirits.
okay.
Is that all right? And it's meant
Light,
just
Light.
light.
Okay.
A light. One of the things I felt about this book is that you're really trying to convince the readers that the counterfeiting was happening.
Well, I tried to piece it together. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
And I think you provided really good evidence, and I think you did a really exhaustive job. And I think in that way it's a groundbreaking book because you're breaking new ground, and that's what historians want to do. One slight thing I felt reading the book is she's working really hard to convince me, right?
yeah.
And
I tried not to do that.
yeah, and I'm not saying that other people are going to have that
I
experience.
tried to lay out the evidence and have you make up your own mind, but I might not have always succeeded.
Well, no, it's okay. Like, it's good. You care about the topic and you put all this work into it. I think what you're doing is making your best case for it. And that's okay. I think that's important, and it may end up being that all the things that you write about are true. There were times where I'm like, I just want to see the evidence and I don't want to feel like I'm being nudged into accepting it. You know what I mean? And the other thing that you're seeing is you know how like to anyone with a hammer, everything's a nail. You know what I mean? Have you heard that phrase? To someone with a hammer,
Yeah.
everything's a nail. That you do want to see, there's a degree to which in the book you want to see counterfeiting in almost everything. And
Really?
But it's also possible that their counterfeiting is influencing everything. And so I haven't come down on whether that's
Well, there was
whether that's
political
legitimate or
power
not.
and okay, I have a friend that's a detective, and he says there's 3 motives, and maybe as a psychologist you would also know about this or have a theory. But he said criminals, and he works with criminals, doing cold cases, and he said there's 3 motives
for every crime.
Right. Sex, power, or money.
Or money. Yep.
So he wasn't only for financial gain with the counterfeiting, but he also had a big motive for power, and he achieved it with all these followers that he gained.
Sure.
And then of course the sex too. I mean, hey, you get a lot of power, you can have a lot of sex. So I mean, but do you really think, examining the life of Joseph Smith, that he didn't have those motives? I mean,
yeah, money, women, and power.
Yeah, but not everybody is motivated by those things.
No.
Not everybody is, and you know that as a psychologist, right?
Yeah.
So
You're reminding me of a really classic scene in the history of cinema, Scarface with Al Pacino. He said, first you get the money, then you get the power. Once you get the power, then you get the women. Have you seen that? Have you seen
really?
Scarface? Did I get it right? Did I get the quote right?
that makes sense. Yeah.
You get the money, which gets you power, which gets you women. Because women like power.
Yeah.
That's what Al Pacino says in Scarface.
and
I'm
you
not
can
saying
start
that's
out
true.
small and get bigger and bigger crimes, just like a legitimate career.
Well, I only say that, what I ended up feeling about this book is, take all the counterfeiting out of it, it's still a masterpiece because
Really?
it helped me understand the context that I think led to the Mormonism. And I think you're right. I think counterfeiting culture heavily influences the Mormon restoration. So I'm not saying that you didn't do a great job. I'm just giving a light criticism that there were times where I didn't care about the counterfeiting. I just wanted to dig into the historical context that you provide that's so helpful. And then there were times where I didn't feel like I was being nudged towards accepting that counterfeiting was everywhere. But having said that, it very well may have been.
Well, that was the official story and the other theories have already been told. They've already.
Right.
I wanted to concentrate on that strain of it. So, yeah.
Well, having said that,
what
I don't think we have to this day, Grant Palmer maybe comes the closest, but he doesn't. What we don't have is a really good book that tries to explain from start to finish a really good case for how the restoration happened from a secular point of view that goes kind of with the timeline, and that just kind of lays it all out, putting the right characters in at the right times, trying to figure out the right motives, and then trying to figure out the right sources for all the different innovations and evolutions of the doctrine and theology that happened. And that's a challenge for you or other historians to put that together, because I think we need good explanations for how the Book of Mormon and the church came to be that are rooted in history, that are more secular. And I'm not sure anyone's ever done that.
Well, I tried to do a lot of it.
You did a lot of it. And that's why you're here on Mormon Stories. Because I think you move the football. If I can use,
good.
I think you move the football in this regard. But I still think we have more work to do.
Well, since they tried to keep it secret, they did their best to. So then it's hard to piece together, because it'd be different if they were honest. But they definitely were not honest people. So, I mean, they made up all kinds of different stories. They were used to doing that, cover stories, Yeah. So, but isn't that mainly what you want to know if you're investigating Mormonism? Were they honest people that actually
And that's
came
how the
up with
church wants to
something?
paint them. They're
Right.
these humble folk that didn't have a formal education, but they were well respected and honest and compassionate and hardworking, and they tilled the land with the, and the farmers, and that's kind of the narrative we're all told.
So are the people that are saying that honest?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But there is such a thing as
honesty.
Yes. I mean, having integrity is important, right? To even for your mental health, I think.
Yeah.
Studying as a nurse, I work with a lot of mentally ill people, and of course that doesn't, say that mentally ill people aren't honest, but for your mental health, to be consistent between your beliefs and your actions is important. I mean, you start deceiving yourself into things. Anyway.
And you could argue there's so much depression and, prescription drug abuse and anxiety and scrupulosity and trauma and, sexual abuse and fraud and schemes of fraud in our culture. If you just look at Utah and all the fraud, all the sexual abuse, all the pornography abuse, all the depression and illness and trauma, it seems that it all comes out of a culture of lies and dishonesty, right? That starts from the very origins of our church.
Which is really sad. And I would like to try to...
That's your motive.
One big motive for writing my book was to help people that, our belief, because beliefs matter. Beliefs have consequences. Beliefs determine what our actions are. And as a psychologist, you know that people's beliefs, and that's what I did my master's degree on, is the psychology of belief, and William James and the variety of religious experiences, and how how it affects people, what their beliefs are. So it matters, and you need to be able to discern truth from error and from falsehood. And why is there so much affinity fraud in Utah? It's higher than other places. It's because people don't use their minds enough to determine if something or somebody is trustworthy. Trust is something that's earned. And you should test people before you put a great amount of trust in them. I mean, you should test them. So do their actions match their words? Do they do what they say they're going to do? What's their reputation? And so when you look at the reputation of Joseph Smith that he had, except among the followers, you can see that he had a pretty bad reputation.